A man lying in an open field, wounded, exposed to the German autumn cold, artillery shells falling around him, unable to move or cry loud enough to be heard over the roar of battle. And for 5 days, nobody came. That man was an American soldier, one of the tens of thousands who pushed into the heart of Germany in the autumn and winter of 1944 as part of an army that history has almost completely forgotten. An army that fought one of the most brutal, grinding, and strategically vital campaigns of the entire Second World War, through mud and mines and stone-walled villages and fortified death traps, on the very doorstep of the enemy's homeland, the American Ninth Army. If this is the kind of history that moves you, take 2 seconds right now and hit that like button. It helps more people find stories like this. October 1944. The war in Europe had reached a turning point that, just 4 months earlier, seemed almost impossible to imagine. Allied forces had landed at Normandy in the greatest amphibious invasion in the history of human warfare. They had broken out of the beachhead, swept across France in a breathless sprint, liberated Paris, pushed through Belgium, and arrived, stunned and exhilarated, at the very border of Germany itself, 233 days ahead of the most optimistic pre-invasion schedule. The door to the heart of the Third Reich seemed to be swinging open, but doors have locks, and this one was defended by something that had been under construction for nearly a decade. The Germans called it the West Wall, the Allies called it the Siegfried Line, and it was, by almost any measure, one of the most formidable defensive systems ever constructed by human hands. Stretching hundreds of miles along Germany's western border, it was a nightmare of interlocking bunkers and concrete pillboxes, fields of jagged anti-tank obstacles called dragon's teeth, minefields woven into the earth so densely that a single wrong footstep could mean amputation or death, and fighting trenches connecting fortification to fortification in a web that no attacker could unravel without bleeding for every inch. Adolf Hitler had ordered its construction in 1934 quietly at first, testing whether France and Britain would react. They didn't. Emboldened, he expanded it northward, fortifying every natural approach into Germany with concrete and steel and the full engineering genius of Organization Todt, the Reich's state construction arm, which had already built the Autobahn from nothing and delivered impossible projects on impossible timelines. The weakest point in the entire West Wall was a stretch of relatively flat, open farmland near a city that sat at the junction of Germany, Holland, and Belgium. A city that was, for Adolf Hitler, it was a symbol of everything Germany believed itself to be. Aachen. Pause for a moment and think about what Aachen meant to the German psyche in 1944. This was the city where Charlemagne was born in 742 AD. This was the seat of the First Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, the original German Empire, the one that had unified a fragmented continent under a single crown. The cathedral in Aachen's center still contained, in 1944, the tomb of Charlemagne himself. The coronation throne where German kings had been crowned for 600 years still sat inside those ancient stone walls. Hitler understood symbols with an instinctive, almost animal intelligence. He knew what it meant to the German people for that city to fall to the Allies. He issued his order personally, in his own hand. Aachen must be held, at all costs. And it was into this landscape, into this combination of ancient symbolism, modern fortification, stone-walled villages, dragon's teeth, minefields, and Hitler's fanatical will that the American Ninth Army was ordered to advance. Most people who know anything about the Second World War in Europe know the names Patton and Bradley and Eisenhower. Some know Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, the most powerful force of American soldiers ever assembled under a single field commander. Some know the British Field Marshal Montgomery, brilliant, controversial, infuriating, but almost nobody knows the name William Hood Simpson. And that is one of the most profound injustices in the entire history of the war. Simpson was from Weatherford, Texas, a small town 40 miles west of Fort Worth. He graduated from West Point in 1909 as one of the worst students in his class, near the very bottom. His classmates that year included 2 men you might have heard of, George S. Patton and Jacob Devers. 6 feet 2 inches tall, bald as a billiard ball, raw-boned and lean in the way that Texas ranching country makes a man lean. He had a warm smile and an even warmer laugh, and his men adored him with the kind of devotion that can only be earned, never demanded. He had earned his Silver Star on the battlefields of the First World War. He had spent the long, quiet decades between the wars not seeking glory, but studying the Command and General Staff School, the Army War College. 2 years teaching military science at Pomona College in California, patient and methodical and always learning. By the time the Second World War came, William Simpson was not a flashy general. He was something far more rare. He was a general who cared. He had a rule he drilled into every officer under his command, with the kind of quiet, immovable conviction that made it clear it was not a suggestion. The rule was this: never send an infantryman to do a job that an artillery shell can do for him. Think about what that rule means. Think about what it means for the men carrying rifles through muddy fields under enemy fire. Think about what it meant to the young soldier lying wounded in a field, who had a commander who thought of him not as an expendable resource, but as a human being whose life was precious and not to be wasted. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, would later say of Simpson, "If he ever made a mistake as Army commander, it never came to my attention." Alert, intelligent, professionally capable, he was the type of leader that American soldiers deserve. He was the type of leader that American soldiers deserve. And yet today, his name appears in almost no popular histories of the war. Why? We'll get to that, because the answer to that question is as dramatic as anything that happened on the battlefield itself. But first, we need to talk about what Simpson and his Ninth Army were about to walk into. By the first week of October 1944, the Ninth Army had been assigned to positions north and east of Aachen, on the extreme left flank of the American forces. At this point, the Army consisted essentially of a single corps, the 19th composed of 3 divisions, the 29th Infantry, the 2nd Armored, and the 30th Infantry Division. Look at a map of that terrain, and your stomach will tighten. The area confronting the Ninth Army was flat, arable farmland, stretching toward the Roer River in the east, almost no natural cover, no hills to shelter behind, no forests to move through unseen. Just open ground, dotted every mile or two with small villages of old, solidly built stone houses, villages that the Germans had long since evacuated of their civilian populations and transformed into fortresses. Each stone house was a potential strongpoint, each village street was a potential killing ground, and beneath the fields, mines. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, some detonate at the lightest touch. Some sophisticated enough to survive the sweeping of mine detection equipment and wait, patient as death, for the weight of a boot. The German army understood this terrain. They had chosen their defensive positions with surgical precision. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Every village was prepared for street fighting of the most brutal, close-quarters kind, and behind all of it sat the Roer River, a natural barrier that, in normal autumn conditions, was manageable. Under wartime flooding conditions, with the right pressure on the right dams upstream, it could be turned into something very close to impassable. This was where the Ninth Army had to operate. This was what General Simpson had to crack open with 3 divisions and the courage of tens of thousands of young American men who had already been fighting for months and were now being sent, after a brief 48-hour rest period, back into the worst the enemy could offer. 48 hours. Let that sit for a moment. The 30th Infantry Division had been fighting continuously through Normandy, through the drive across France and Belgium, through the brutal combat around Aachen. And in early November 1944, they were sent to a rest camp at a place called Kerkrade in Holland, approximately 5 miles behind the front line. They were given 48 hours. A recreation program was provided. The men were free to spend their time as they wished, 48 hours of being a human being rather than a soldier. 48 hours to sleep, to eat something that wasn't field rations, to write a letter home, to think about something other than which building might have a German sniper behind its window. And then they were sent back, straight back to the front. That is the reality of what these men lived, not the cinematic version of war with dramatic music and slow-motion heroism. The actual version: 48 hours of rest, then back into the mud and the cold and the mines and the artillery. On November 10th, General Eisenhower himself arrived to inspect Ninth Army troops. He visited the 29th Infantry Division in Holland, then crossed into Germany to see the 30th Division just over the Netherlands border. He shook hands with enlisted men from the front lines. He complimented them on their work. He looked into the faces of men who were about to be sent into one of the most dangerous operations of the campaign. And 6 days later, the offensive began. November 16th, 1944. At 1100 hours, 12 squadrons of fighter bombers from the 9th Tactical Air Command swept in over the target area. Medium and heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force made their runs over German communication centers Linnich, Aldenhoven, Jülich, and beyond. The sky was full of aircraft, and the ground shook with the weight of what was being delivered onto it. Then the ground forces moved. The 1st and 9th United States Armies rushed eastward in a coordinated attack from Aachen toward the Roer River. The final objectives were the Cologne Plain and the great industrial zone of the Roer, the beating industrial heart of the Third Reich. If they could reach it, if they could cut it off and destroy it, Germany's ability to sustain the war would be crippled beyond recovery. But between the jump-off line and those objectives lay every horror that a determined enemy in prepared fortifications could place in their path. The 2nd Armored Division and the 29th Infantry Division moved through the town of Berden toward their assembly point for the general drive east. Tanks assembled in a shallow valley a mile west of the town, using the natural dip in the terrain to avoid enemy observation. When the air and artillery bombardment ended, they came out of concealment and began the advance. They moved over open territory, constant artillery fire, small arms crackling from the stone houses of every village they approached. One of the first objectives was the town of Luck, a small German settlement that the 2nd Armored Division, supported by a regiment of the 102nd Infantry Division, attacked and seized within the first 2 hours of the operation on November 16th. 2 hours. But the town was still under heavy mortar and artillery fire the day after its capture, as troops and equipment had to continue passing through it. Beyond Luck lay more open fields and harder fighting. By the 18th of November, American troops had entered Seersdorf. By the end of that same day, they had cleared 2/3 of the town, with units from all 3 divisions of the 19th Corps fighting through it simultaneously, building by building, room by room. The way you have to fight when every stone house is a fortress, and every doorway might have a man with a machine gun behind it. The 29th Division, meanwhile, was battling for the town of Borheim, a fight so savage that the infantry had to use small arms and mortars in house-to-house combat, with medical teams constantly moving up to pull wounded men from the rubble, administer first aid under fire, and get them back to some semblance of safety. Aldenhoven fell on the 21st. It was the first important objective reached by the 29th Division, the halfway point on the road to Jülich. The town had been hit so hard by artillery and air bombardment that medics picking through the ruins found the remains of a church, standing open to the sky, its walls pocked with craters. In front of it, men of the 81st Tank Destroyer Battalion had set up a 3-inch anti-tank gun in the rubble of what had once been a place of worship. That image tells you something about the nature of this campaign, something that no statistic can quite capture. The sacred and the brutal, side by side, in a ruined German city that most people have never heard of. To the north of the main American drive, a different kind of operation was unfolding, one that illustrated just how much the Allied forces had learned about modern warfare since the beaches of Normandy. The German city of Geilenkirchen was a significant defensive hub. Taking it required a joint operation between the American 84th Division and the British 43rd Infantry Division, a combined Allied force operating under shared command, moving on the city from 2 different directions simultaneously. The British moved in from the northwest, their column, including Sherman tanks, manned by British personnel, and their famous flail tanks, specialized armor, equipped with rotating chains that beat the ground ahead of the vehicle, detonating mines before the infantry walked over them. These machines were an innovation born of pure necessity. In the killing ground of mine-laden terrain, they were worth their weight in gold. Meanwhile, 700 yards southeast of the town, American engineers and infantry were dealing with a minefield of approximately 300 enemy mines, each one a potential death or maiming for any soldier who didn't spot it in time. American infantry advanced past deactivated mines, watching the ground with an intensity that becomes second nature only after you've seen what a mine does to a human body. The assault on Geilenkirchen included something remarkable, something that was being used by the 9th Army for the very first time at this battle: psychological warfare. Loudspeakers. American forces set up loudspeaker systems and broadcast messages directly to the German defenders inside the city, urging them to surrender. 300 Germans came out of the buildings with their hands up in response to that broadcast. 300 men chose life over orders because someone on the other side found a way to reach them not with bullets, but with words. Geilenkirchen fell by 1400 hours on the 19th of November. Engineers immediately began deactivating a demolition charge the Germans had placed under a bridge before withdrawal. Communications were established as soon as the town was secured. An Allied military government was set up, and notices were posted in English and German. The pattern was the same everywhere this army went. Destroy what must be destroyed, then immediately try to restore what had been taken from the civilians caught in the middle of it all. And then the weather broke. On November 20th, the day after Geilenkirchen fell, a sustained deterioration in the weather began across the entire front. Rain, cold, mud of a depth and consistency that defied movement. For 5 days, operations along the entire 9th Army front were hampered to the point of near paralysis. Imagine what that mud meant. Tanks slipping off roads, jeeps sinking axle-deep in fields. Medical evacuation, the life-or-death business of getting wounded men from where they fell to where they could be treated, became an ordeal of improvisation and desperation. Medics using jeeps rigged with litters, driving through mud that threatened to swallow the vehicles whole, carrying wounded men by hand when the vehicles couldn't make it. Soldiers of the 84th Division, advancing on the town of Lindern, had to carry water, rations, and mail to men entrenched north of Oper entirely by hand. The mud made vehicle movement impossible. Everything went on foot, through the cold and the wet, under the constant threat of artillery fire. In one sector, a field artillery battalion improvised shelters by dragging large concrete pipes found in the area into position to provide protection against German shelling on the reverse slope of hills. When there is no better option, you use what the ground gives you. A battalion of the 84th Division near the approaches to Worm established a line of mortars 100 yards behind the front, with all ammunition and supplies carried forward by hand through mud that seemed to have no bottom. Snipers were active. Troops advanced with a constant, exhausting alertness that no amount of training can fully prepare you for, and no amount of rest can fully recover you from. And through all of it, the mud and the cold and the enemy fire and the exhausted bodies and the grinding attrition, the 9th Army kept moving east, toward the river. Now I need to tell you about the darkest moment of this entire campaign. The moment that, when you hear it, captures the absolute human cost of what was being asked of these men in a way that nobody can count. A man lay in a field for more than 5 days after being wounded by artillery. 5 days. He was there through the rain, through the cold nights, through the mud. The battle moved past him and around him, and for 5 days he lay there, alive, waiting for someone to find him. When he was finally located by first aid men, he was still alive. Consider the will to live that requires. Consider what those 5 days must have felt like, hour by hour, as the sky changed from day to night and back again, as the sounds of battle moved and shifted around him, as he drifted in and out of consciousness and pulled himself back, again and again, because giving up was not in him. He was one man, one of the 10,256 American casualties the 9th Army sustained in this campaign. Each one of those casualties was a human being with a name and a family and a life they were trying to get back to. Each one represents a story like this one, a story of endurance beyond what most of us can imagine. And then there were the Germans. As the American drive continued and the towns fell one by one, prisoners were taken and brought back through the lines for examination. The interrogators noticed something as the campaign progressed into December, something that spoke to just how desperately the Third Reich was consuming its own future. Many of the German casualties and prisoners were mere boys. Boys! Hitler's Germany had already consumed its professional soldiers, its hardened veterans, its trained officers, and experienced sergeants. Now it was sending children to hold the line. Boys who had grown up under Nazi propaganda, who had never known a Germany that wasn't at war, who were now being placed in stone-walled villages with rifles and told to stop the most powerful army on earth. Some of them fought with a ferocity born of indoctrination and desperation. Some of them surrendered, stunned and disoriented. At the first moment, they were given a credible path to survival, and some of them died in those fields and those streets, far from any home that was worth dying for. War does not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent in its mechanics. That is its deepest crime. Through November and into December, the 9th Army's 13th Corps, newly formed and comprising the 84th Division, the 102nd Division, and the 7th Armored Division pressed on toward the towns closest to the Roer. The 102nd Division and the 7th Armored took Leyfarth on December 1st, fighting their way into the town in the late evening, and by midnight holding 2/3 of it. The following day, the entire town was cleared. Moving through Leyfarth, troops of the 102nd Division on December 2nd captured and cleared Kurenzig, a town sitting directly on the bank of the Roer River. The same day, Flossdorf, another river town further south, was entered and taken. The capture of those two towns allowed the 13th Corps to achieve its primary objective, clearing the west bank of the Roer River of enemy troops. Meanwhile, to the south, the 29th Division and tanks of the 2nd Armored Division were in some of the most bitter fighting of the entire campaign. The Hassen Camp Gut, an isolated cluster of fortified farm buildings a mile north of Jülich, held out against American assault for 6 full days of constant effort. The infantry regiment assigned to take it had to be relieved after those 6 days, having poured everything they had into the objective and still not secured it. 6 days of constant assault, with men being fed into that fight day after day, and the position still holding. When the isolated buildings were finally cleared, the defenders turned out to be a mixture of hardened soldiers and more of those boys. The 115th Regiment of the 29th Division finally cleared that position on December 8th. And on December 15th, the 30th Division, coordinating closely with the 1st Army to the south, cleared out the final pocket of German resistance in what was known as the Ruhr Triangle, a wedge of contested territory formed by the confluence of 2 rivers, territory that the Germans had used to maintain pressure on the American left flank. The Roer had flooded to 3 times its normal width from the autumn rains. It presented a formidable barrier to men and equipment both. But by December 15, 1944, all territory west of the Roer River was under American control. The campaign from Aachen to the Roer was complete. 10,256 American casualties, hundreds of towns and villages were cleared, miles of Siegfried Line fortifications pierced, bypassed, or demolished. One of the most strategically complex and physically brutal campaigns of the entire European theater, fought in terrain specifically designed to make attackers bleed for every yard, and almost nobody remembers it. But the story of William Simpson and the 9th Army does not end at the Roer, because now the river itself became the obstacle, and what happened next is where this story finds its true climax. The Germans knew that the 9th Army was coming, and they had one last card to play. Upstream from the American positions, the Germans controlled a series of dams on the Roer River. On February 9, 1945, as the 9th Army was preparing for its crossing, German engineers jammed open the discharge valves of those dams. The river exploded outward. What had been a manageable crossing planned, rehearsed, prepared for, became a torrent up to 1,200 yards wide in some places, surging with a current that swept away boats and tore apart makeshift bridges before they could be anchored. The 9th Army had to wait. For 11 days, General Simpson, 56 years old, watching the water levels with an engineer's precision and a commander's agony, was effectively frozen in place while the Canadian and British forces to his north, who had already launched their half of the pincer attack in Operation Veritable, fought alone against the bulk of the German defensive strength. Montgomery had planned for the 2 operations to coincide. The Canadians and British were engaging 11 German divisions, while Simpson sat on the bank of a river he couldn't yet cross. But Simpson used every one of those 11 days. He built his army to over 300,000 men. He stockpiled 46,000 tons of artillery ammunition, the largest concentration of American firepower yet assembled on the Western Front. He gathered 1,000 tanks and 2,000 field guns. And when his engineers told him the water levels would be at their lowest around February 25th, he decided to move on the 23rd to take the Germans by surprise, to hit them before they expected it. At 2:45 in the morning of February 23rd, 1,945 1,500 guns opened fire simultaneously across the Roer River. The night sky turned to day. After 45 minutes of bombardment, the infantry of 6 divisions dragged 15-man assault boats down to the muddy riverbanks and into the water. The current was still powerful. Some boats broadsided and spun away downstream. German mortars and small arms peppered the crossing from the far bank. Successive waves hit the water and pushed through. By the end of that day, 28 of Simpson's infantry battalions had crossed the Roer River. Because of the elaborate security precautions Simpson had taken, the Germans were caught genuinely off guard. They had no major counterattack ready. By February 25th, the 9th Army linked up with the 1st Army in a 25-mile bridgehead from Ball to Durin. The breakout began. Operation Grenade, as the crossing was called, ended on March 5th with just over 1,400 American casualties, inflicting 16,000 casualties on the Germans and capturing 29,000 prisoners. General Omar Bradley would later call the February 23 crossing one of the most perfectly executed operations of the war. One of the most perfectly executed operations of the war. That was William Simpson, the man nobody wrote biographies about, the man whose army has no Hollywood epic. The man who graduated near the bottom of his West Point class and became, in the estimation of his peers and his enemies alike, one of the finest field commanders of the entire Second World War. And then came the cruelest moment. By April 11, 1945, the 2nd Armored Division had raced 52 miles in a single day to reach the Elbe River near Magdeburg. Berlin was 60 miles away. Simpson had been moving at a speed that seemed almost impossible, 226 miles from the Rhine to the Elbe in 19 days. His corps commanders told him they could be in Berlin within 48 hours. He believed them. He flew to General Bradley's headquarters at Wiesbaden with his heart full of something he hadn't let himself feel since the crossing, the specific, electric certainty of a commander who knows he can finish what he started. Bradley met him, and Bradley told him to sit down. "You must stop on the Elbe," Bradley said. "You are not to advance any farther in the direction of Berlin." "I'm sorry, Simp, but there it is." Simpson asked where the order came from. "For Mike," Bradley said. Eisenhower had decided on March 28 that Berlin would be left to the Soviet Red Army. The political calculation, the shape of post-war Europe, the agreements with Stalin, the cost in American lives of fighting into a city the Soviets were already converging on, had superseded the military one. Simpson flew back to his headquarters in what he later described as a kind of daze. "All I could think of," he said, "was, how am I going to tell my staff, my corps commanders, and my troops? Above all, how am I going to tell my troops?" He was heartbroken, genuinely, deeply heartbroken. That is not the emotion we usually associate with generals. We imagine them as men of steel, indifferent to disappointment, moved only by tactics and strategy and the cold arithmetic of war. But William Simpson sat in that airplane, flying back to his command, with a breaking heart, for his soldiers. For the men who had bled from Aachen to the Roer, and from the Roer to the Rhine, and from the Rhine to the Elbe. For the men who had spent those 48 hours of rest in Kerkrade and then gone straight back to the front. For the man who had lain in that field for 5 days and still refused to die. He couldn't give them Berlin. It wasn't his to give anymore. The war ended for the 9th Army in the first days of May 1945. They had captured more than 750,000 German prisoners of war. They had liberated nearly 600,000 Allied prisoners of war and 1.25 million displaced persons. They had crossed 2 of the great rivers of Europe under fire. They had performed by any objective military measure, as well as any army in the history of American warfare. And when the promotions came, when Generals Bradley, Devers, Patton, and Hodges all received their 4th stars, in March 1945, William Simpson was passed over. Simpson had to wait until 1954, 9 years after the war ended, for Congress to promote him to the rank of full general. 9 years. For a man of whom Eisenhower said, if he ever made a mistake as army commander, it never came to my attention. There is something that history does to the people who fight its most important battles, and it is not always fair.